See if I can find something that I can play in the background that isn't going to overtake everything.
Have you ever wondered what would happen if you actually sat down and talked with missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ?
So, this video, or information, I don't know what to call it, is really just for me to keep track of this, and I don't expect anyone else to listen to it, so I can play music in the background to it because I don't have to worry about copyright. Before the beginning of creation, there was only God. And God, actually, let me back up even further. Before there was God, there was a random chance, I believe. I don't know what it is that caused God to be God. But God is God because God has absolute faith, absolute hope, and absolute love. God is the absolute form of all three of those combined into one being, entity, person. I guess we'll just say person. Because God doesn't be the way that we be. He doesn't commit the act of being the way that we do. And God doesn't have a gender. I'm just used to saying he because it's a vestigial term that I've borrowed from antiquity. But the time or place or whatever you want to call it, event before creation and even before God's birth is that there were, I guess you would say, reference frames and the way that we look at it, even though that doesn't really fit there either, because like I said, there is no being yet. That comes later. There's no nothing, there's no being, and there's no indiscernibility. There is no space, there's no time, there's no sin, there's not even God yet. There's just not anything at all that you could ever conceive of, which would make it a non-event. That is the zeroth point of origin of even God. There is not an event. There is not a happening. There is not any time or space. There is not even nothing before God. So I don't know why or what caused it, but God ended up with absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute hope for absolutely everything, absolutely everyone, absolutely everywhere, absolutely all the time. And it wasn't, there wasn't anyone else who could. And anyone else who would have, due to Leibniz's law of indiscernibles, would have just melded in with God, because those are the only properties that I can even attempt at pointing to that God has. And God doesn't even have properties, because God created all of these things. He can't be or have any of those things. So there aren't really any words to describe this, but if you keep that in mind, that there aren't really any words to describe it, then you can remember that these are just analogies, but they are poor fitting analogies because it's God. And with God being necessarily transcendent to absolutely everything that we could ever imagine, including what I've already just said, then this is basically a lie. It's not true. But then again, neither is anything else that anyone else says about God, so I guess I'm in good company. But the way that I see it is that the thing that makes God God is that only God has absolute value for all beings, being infinite. That there's no one that God does not value. There's nothing that God doesn't value. God even values nothing. paradoxically, along with everything. So, being that that's the case, you can already see the level of transcendence that God has over us is so profound that literally there are no words to describe it, or to describe God. I'm trying to point at that fact and give it some spin for anyone to grab onto so they can be moved to that place. But you have to remember that this is kind of like trying to walk across the ocean or drive into space. You can't drive to the moon, but I can give you a simulation which is similar enough to the experience that it could be analogous to it. And that is to consider that God is the absolute form of faith, hope, and love. And that God values absolutely everything as infinitely valuable. And that's what makes God God. That's not anything at all to do with forcing people to do anything or systematically, deliberately constructing everything in existence to his own personal arbitrary standards, like the Old Testament says. I don't believe that. And if I end up going to hell for that reason, and I very well might, I can't make myself believe something that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to believe that God is some old guy that lives in the sky that one day got bored and decided to make everything the way it is. That just doesn't make any sense. I think the way that it is that God, through either, in my opinion, random chance, because that gave everyone an equal opportunity. How do you feel about everything? How do you, without first having known it, but picture that you have your mind erased, like Men in Black. You just no memory of anything before. And you're presented with everyone and everything else in existence all at once. So the instant that you become born, you're shocked to find everything in existence already there. What are your thoughts about it? That is your origin, your root, what you found valuable as you looked across the infinite expanse of everything that exists, everything that does not exist, everything that could and couldn't exist. God, the devil, the demiurge, every person that ever lived, every event that ever happened, every object that was ever built or destroyed, everything that you could ever imagine, all existing as one giant photograph that you can see all of simultaneously with infinite perfect resolution, as God does. Out of that gigantic, vast infinitude, what do you value most? And what do you value least? And how does it feel to you? What is the overall impression that you have? And the way that it strikes you, in my opinion, in my belief, is dependent upon the location that you occupy, because everything that we experience down here is relative. And if I stand inside my apartment, it looks one way. If I stand outside my apartment, it looks completely different, but it's the same apartment. So if you picture that all and you say, okay, so the way that I looked at everything in existence in that fraction of an instant before I was born, when I first became conceived according to God, not the world. I wasn't conceived yet in the world, but I was conceived in the light of God, that my soul was born. In what state was my soul first born? Before I had yet incarnated into a body, I already had a form. I already had a state. I already had a root, an emotive approach, a stance, a posture toward existence. And how did I get there? Well, because there wasn't anything yet in existence and there was no time or space to move around, that is my origin. That's just where everything began, and it had to begin somewhere. And there's a giant map that has everybody in it and everything in it somewhere. And so there's a root somewhere in there that I first emerged as. And how did I get there is kind of like asking asking a physicist what happened before the Big Bang. It's ontologically meaningless. It's cosmologically meaningless because there was not yet anything else in existence yet to allow me the movement or change, because there wasn't any time yet. There was no time to change. There was no space to change, etc. So I just have it. Now, asking like why do I personally have that root? And then because of that root, I can then explain, okay, well, I ended up being born in this body because I valued existence in this particular way. I was seeking something of value in this life that I have the potential to get, and that's what fulfills my soul. And if I get that, then I get a spiritual fulfillment. I grow, I extend, I build upon what I already valued and deepen that, and fill in the gaps and experience life, grow as a person, gain wisdom and fulfillment. And if I fail at it, then I'm filled with angst and disappointment or fear or meaninglessness and nihilism and self-destructive rage and self-loathing. At which point I make my values a little bit easier to attain by having less of them. And then I incarnate again in a lower form so that I have a simpler life, so that it's easier for me to fulfill my spiritual needs. And you would be amazed at how low you can go. You can get to the point of less than a quark and value basically nothing. The tiniest little flicker of a ghost of a hope still lingers always in everyone's souls. You can't fully ever extinguish the light, but it can get buried pretty goddamn deep. And so you can go all the fucking way down to the skin of nothing, the edge of nothing, the gates of hell, the pits of hell, whatever you want to call it. And I don't believe that there's a hell at the center of the earth or anything like that, but I do think that it's a good picture, it's a good painting. If you wanted to look at an image that is analogous to, what happens to someone's soul, what region do they occupy when they don't value things? Well, they occupy the center. The center is the center of mass. It's the resistance to change. It's the part that didn't want to get woken up. Where, how I said everybody has their own approach? Well, the devil's approach is to be like, why did you even wake me up? I was better off before I ever even existed. I don't appreciate anything in this place. I don't like anything here. That kind of mentality. Well, where is that? That's at the center, deep, deep, deep down, way far away from God, who would be like the sky. Or maybe even the sun in the sky. That's probably the best way of putting it. So God would be like this. Again, it's a painting, it's an analogy, whatever. It's poetry. But that's the only way that you can describe this stuff, because there aren't any words for it. So anything that I say about it's going to be wrong, but I'm hoping that I can point you towards it, or myself, or whoever this is. And God would be the sun, and creation, or the world, or that giant photograph of everyone and everything in it, would be the sky. And the center of the earth, or the center of the deepest pit that you could possibly imagine there being, which, if it were a single iota deeper, would penetrate and kill God. It's that far, almost all the way back around deep. It's so deep, it's almost high. And you could get confused if you got disoriented. You could think that that's God and that God is the devil. And that is nihilism. That's when you don't value anything. Or you could even start to value nothing. And that's active nihilism. There's passive nihilism where you don't believe anything is valuable. And there's active nihilism where you actively worship and participate destruction. And most people have passive nihilistic depression occasionally. Like, they'll wonder about the meaning of existence, and their ex will leave them and they'll say, oh, woe is me. And so everything's all fucked up. Or their dog dies, or their kid dies, or their spouse commits suicide, or something like that happens, and then they'll feel like passive nihilism, where it's just depression. It's almost like a shock, where it's like, I don't see how any of this could have any meaning. I can't see any coherent pattern to anything. It's all just this existentially absurd, weird, rare, random, like a ghost that never lived. There was no one that ever was this ghost. It has always been here. It's eerie. It's like really weird. But then there's active nihilism, which feels a hell of a lot better, in my opinion. And that's more on if you're going to choose between masochism, which is what passive nihilism is, and sadism, which is what active nihilism is. Sadism always feels better than masochism, because at least you value something. Now, it might be the wrong thing, but at least you're valuing something. Now, that is something that God can use to help you and work on you with. You've got something for God to grab onto because you value something. Again, I wouldn't advocate for valuing nothing or the destruction of things into nothing, but at least it's something. At least it's better than just not believing that anything has any value. At least you're worshiping something. At least you're pointed towards something and moving towards some goal. So it's a step above the passive, for sure. And that's when you're flipped upside down and you lift your head up and see the devil as if he were God. That's active nihilism. Passive nihilism is when you've just got your eyes shut and you don't see anything. And then if you start to grow out of that, and I would say passive nihilism is absolutely at the depths of pure hell. That's the deepest pit of absolute hell. I don't think that the devil is an active nihilist. I think that the devil is a passive nihilist. I think the devil is passive and just basically does things out of a feeling of necessity, which is why he hates everything, because he's then bound and forced to do something. Whereas if there weren't anything there, then he wouldn't have to do anything. And existence is a tragedy to the devil because of all the sin and error and darkness. And really, ultimately, deeper than that is the problem. There's a problem of evil, which is all the darkness and bad things that happen. But there's a deeper problem than the problem of evil, which is the problem of, I would say, existence itself. The problem of existence is, in God's creating, God creates both good and evil. So is creation good or evil? And it really isn't either, and yet it's both. And if you were to look at it from the devil's perspective, you would see that existence doesn't deserve to exist because it didn't get the choice to be God. It didn't get the choice to be itself. It didn't get the choice not to be here. It was plucked from somewhere and placed here. And by what right? Who turned the lights on, and why did I get woken up? I was better off asleep. That's the devil's perspective. And there's a sinking, seductive falling into when you approach the devil, because there is validity in that. I did not choose to be here, and this world exists totally independently from my will. And by its very existence of being independent from me, it is imposing itself upon me. And I shatter against its rigid, uncaring, unmoving, unapproachable form that I can neither understand nor accept, because it's not of myself. If everything in existence were part of my control, then it would all be my fault. Whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, that's up to me. I can turn the light on, I can turn the light off, I can put a black light in, I could put a red light in, I could put a blue light in, I could put a green light in, whatever light, I could combine them, whatever I want to do, dim it, illuminate it, whatever I want. But given the fact that I don't have that total control, and yet I must exist in a world in which someone does, but it ain't me, there's something inherently evil about that, because how dare this person take me and put me here when I didn't ask to be here, and I can't leave, and I can't get out, and I can never cease to be. I will always be something. And now I don't have the choice. I don't have the chance now not to exist. I am trapped here, like everyone and everything else here. I didn't ask to be here, and I can't get out of here. Even if I die, my soul lives on in some hell that I didn't invent, that someone else created, that I didn't want to go to, that I didn't ask for, that if I didn't exist, wouldn't have to go to. But because someone else made the choice to make me exist, I now have to face hell. Why? I didn't choose anything. I didn't get asked whether or not I wanted to exist. I just got forced here. I just got put here, like everyone and everything else. Every single atom in existence is screaming as it scrapes along everything else's inability to tolerate it. It's like living in a constantly breaking vase of glass, where every motion, every movement that I make shatters more glass and cuts me deeper and deeper and deeper. And even if I sit still, it cuts me. Nothing stands absolutely still, is the devil's point. I can never make it stop. No matter how much I hate it, no matter how much I loathe it, no matter how little I value it, it continues, and I can never make it stop. And there's something frightening about that. And so you can look at the world that way, and you can follow the devil into the pits of hell, and it's easy to do. But the opposite way of looking at it is, I didn't earn this, but yet someone gave me this gift, this infinite gift, where I have near absolute freedom. And I didn't earn it, and I didn't create myself, but someone had the graciousness, the mercy, the love, the faith, and the hope to put me here, expecting that I would hopefully find something good. And you can look at it in both ways, but here we are nonetheless. And so I say, I believe that there was some, if it wasn't randomness, it was something like randomness, like a lottery, and God just happened to draw the lucky number, and he's the one that is at the highest, and he's the one that just happened to approach existence when the light came on. It's the exact reversal of Armageddon. It's like they say how God will come, no one knows the hour of the time, God comes like a thief in the night. It's exactly the same thing, but in reverse when God was born, and indeed the rest of our souls vicariously from God were born in that same way, like a thief in the night. God was caught unaware, but because for some reason he had this absolute faith in everything, he made it through. And that faith was reflected back to God, and so it was like God was bathing in his own perfection, basking in his own light. For an eternal instant, God was perfection in perfection. There was a perfect reflection of his glory reflected back to him. Everywhere he looked, he saw his own perfect being and the glory and depth and awesomeness that God is reflected everywhere all the time with no gaps. But there was a hole that appeared, because what about what happened before God was there? And that's lights out. So who created who? Did the devil create God, or did God create the devil? Neither, and yet both. Now, even though God was able to bask in his own eternal glory, it was only until he began to look out of himself. As soon as God looked outside of himself and saw the nothing, or the not God, that it pre-existed God, when he saw the not God out there, because I can't say it's nothing, because it's not actually nothing yet. Now, it is the source of nothing, but it's also the source of indiscernibility. So it's not exactly evil. It's just not God. So there's not God, and then there is God. And when God gets born, he first experiences an eternal instant of just being reflected in his own glory. But then something changes. He decides that he wants to look out, or he's seen every part of himself and is still curious, or still has faith that boils over or spills over or something like that. And when God looks outside of himself, he sees not God, which is the devil, which pre-existed God, if you wanted to think of it in God's perspective. From God's perspective, the devil created God. From the devil's perspective, God created the devil. And that's only because they both appeared simultaneously in a causally dynamic relation. But there's and then there's the demiurge, which is the in-between, the skin or bridge in between God and the devil. So I like to think of God as being the periphery, the demiurge as being the volume, and the devil as being the center of this omniversal landscape of God's birth. And so there's sort of like a lottery, and you could have drawn, if you were to appear here in the realm of the absolutes, you could have drawn any of these numbers. So there was then, before they kind of drew apart from each other, they may have been mixed together in some weird ass way. And maybe that's what pre-existed all three of them, was this weird mixture of God, the devil, and the demiurge. But yet, they're not like personalities that all exist in someone's head, because at least that gets kept somewhat straight. These people are not people, and they don't have names. But there's a combination of God, the devil, and the demiurge, which pre-existed each of those. And God is the light extracted from whatever that is, and the demiurge is the grayscale between white and black, and the devil is the black darkness or void that's extracted from this combination, whatever this combination is. And I guess you could call that unity. And I don't know what would have caused unity, but you've got unity where everything is just pure chaos. And from that random chaos, it just so happens to be the case that God is God, the devil is the devil, and the demiurge is the demiurge. And they just so happen to be in that place at that time, or draw those lucky numbers or unlucky numbers, depending on how you look at it. and that was it. And there was only one number per. So it wasn't, if somebody took it, then no one else had a chance. Kind of, and yet not, because like I say, it's a mixture, it's a chaos. There's not really any names, there's not really any beings yet. There's no distinction between anything and anything else. It's just this absolute singularity where everything is unified in a single state. And it's not cohesive. It's completely fragmented, fluid, destructive, bizarre, paradoxical, erroneous, non-existent, or I guess I should say pre-existent or proto-existent. No, pre-existent. God is proto-existent, and creation is existent. Excuse me. So, unity is pre-existent, and like I say, it's just random chaos, messiness. There's not any discrete anything. There's no time, there's no space, there's no lines, there's no grids, there's no if and then implications, there's no anything that we can imagine except for chaos and messiness. And from that, then we get all of our roots. So first, the very first beings that came out of that mess were God, the devil, and the demiurge, and they all three appeared simultaneously. And they formed a causally dynamic interrelationship with each other, such that God was on high, the above, or like I say, the periphery, or what's beyond the sky. The demiurge is the volume, or the bridge in between God and the devil, because you have to have a bridge. Think about this. If the devil were forced into being here by random chance, just randomly, he found himself there, that's not really fair. He has to have a bridge to get closer to God if he chooses to do so. Now that he is here, if you think about existence as being intrinsically good, it could only be good if it doesn't violate the 2/3 law of consent. Given the fact that none of these three consented before, they were just chosen by random chance. So they can't have consented before. They can't have chosen this. They were chosen. They did not choose. And again, if they had chosen, then they would be, if they chose themselves, then that would be unfair, because what gave them the right to do that? But if they were chosen by random chaotic chance, that they just so happened to be, and anyone shared in that equal opportunity, but they just for some reason decided not to take it, and those three decided that they wanted to take that, then that's fair. And again, these aren't three numbers in a lottery that someone just happened to draw. You have to remember that everything was chaos before then, so there were no people. It's that the people emerged out of the chaos. So there were no people there, so they didn't make a choice. So if you wanted to think of proto-people, like vapors that would one day condense into a person, like a fetus, if we were all fetuses in this unity, chaotic void space, where there's nothing that we could ever discern as being discrete from one to the other, which is kind of the way that we do think of fetuses, is that they're not really a person yet. They're just sort of, especially when they're a zygote, when they just first get conceived, they're not really their own being, because their only ability to live has been given to them by the spermatozoa and the, what is that called, the ovum, and those combining somehow cause the person to emerge. But before that, there aren't people. So if you were to use the analogy of sperm and egg being like proto-people, so you've got sperm, egg, and zygote. The zygote is the single cell that the egg turns into after it gets fertilized by the sperm. So you can think of each of them as occupying one of those roles. I guess God would be the sperm, the devil would be the egg, and the demiurge would be the zygote, something like that. And that, when you think about it in those terms, the sperm was created by the human that, the dude that somehow created those sperm. And where did that human come from? Other sperm fertilizing other eggs and forming other zygotes. So you could either say that there was an infinite number of these instances that occurred, and this just happens to be one of them. And in this instance, God was God, the devil was the devil, and the demiurge was the demiurge. But that would be like a Mormon view, which I reject because it's illogical. Because we can discern these times. Here's where I break this apart. There's a problem in philosophy called the self-inclusion paradox. Or I don't really know what other people call it, but I call it the self-inclusion paradox. And it's the paradox that happens when you consider the set of all sets. Does the set of all sets contain itself? Well, it is a set, and so then it must contain itself. But if it contains itself, then how does that even work? How can something contain itself? How can a box contain its own box? Like it doesn't have enough room to grab around itself, to contain itself. So every time I visualize this box that contains another box, that other box has to be smaller than the box that it's contained within. It can't be the same size and yet be contained within it. What does it mean to be contained? It means to fit within something else. If you're uncontained, then you're either larger than the thing that you're trying to fit into, or in some other way you just don't fit into it, and so then you're not contained in it. But if you do fit in it, then you are contained in it. And so if you look at the set of all sets, a box that's bigger than everything, that contains everything else in it, is impossible in the naive sense when you first encounter it. But it becomes possible if you think of there being an origin to this. It's impossible when you look at the box as already having contained everything, past tense. But it's possible when you've got a box that's supposed to fill that role in the future but has not yet done so. And you start from the very beginning at the origin where there's just nothing and this box. Okay, so then what does the box that contains everything contain? Nothing at that zeroth time. When it first emerges, there's nothing in the box. It's just the box, and then there's nothing inside of it. And then the next instant, then there's got to be a box that contains that box. And the reason that second box doesn't come into existence until after the first one comes into existence is because, or I guess I should say the zeroth and the first, not the first and the second. The reason that the first box doesn't emerge until after the zeroth box does is because of the act of iteration and the limits of iterations. An iteration is when everything has settled into a permanent, defined, discrete structure, which is discernible. As soon as it becomes discernible and static and non-moving, and it becomes certain, there are no more room for probabilities. It is a certain, exact structure. It's precise to an infinite resolution, and it's absolutely static to the point where it literally never changes. It's always the same, given some time and space for which it to occupy. But abstractly, just taken in and of itself, the only thing that it has to do is satisfy its own self-perpetuation, that it doesn't destroy itself. So it just has to be able to integrate with itself. All the parts fit within itself. And then it actualizes, it iterates, it becomes discernible. As soon as that happens, then we move from that standpoint beyond that. And so we have an origin which is static, and then upon that we place a foundation for a structure, which then eventually manifests and becomes very complex. But it begins with a single iteration, which I call the 0th iteration. And this is all kind of talking about the same time and space as the time and space before God and during God's birth. So the creation of God, not God's creation. So that's what I call the 0th iteration. It is an iteration, but there are no iterations before it. And so that's what I was saying as far as like, I don't believe the Mormon religion or dogma about how there's an infinite procession of gods that created gods that created gods that created God. I don't believe that. I think that's absolutely irrational, illogical, and silly, because there is no way to ever describe how that ever got going, because there would have had to have been a place and a time where there were no gods, and then suddenly there's an infinitude of gods with no step in between. I think that that's silly. And I don't believe that God ever broke any kind of logic in order to become God. And I can't, because if I believe that God became God without logic, then I can't really value anything logical, can I? Because then it's obviously not of God. But if God is logical, or at the very least doesn't violate logic, then I can still value logic. So I choose to believe, because of my particular, as I usually call it, bent, or my approach to being, my approach to existence, is logical. So I value logic, and so then I look at this way. But it's just one view among an infinite number of possible views. But I believe that the only way that we can distinguish between one of these iterations in which the set of all sets contains every other set, and actually see one set versus another set where it doesn't collapse into a singularity, like that infinitude of gods creating gods, creating gods, creating gods, collapses into a singularity which we just call God. And then we ask, where did that come from? And then the Mormons have no answer, because you can't have anything beyond that, because it's an infinitude. And so then they say that anything before that is meaningless, and yet they can't explain how that happened. But I can. I can go further. So, if you go before God having been created, and you say that there is this 0th iteration, where before the 0th iteration, at the negative first iteration, if you will, there was not even nothing, because that's not even an iteration. So you could picture the vase shattering. There isn't anything there. There's nothing to fit anything into. There is no time to fit anything into. There's no space to fit anything into. Everything has collapsed not only to a singularity, but beyond that into an anti-singularity, meaning not even nothing, not even one thing, not even an infinitude. Just, there isn't anything there. That's meaningless. That is the absolute extent of meaninglessness that I can get to. It's something that you literally can't even put into words. You can only say that it is not everything. It is not nothing, and it is not anything in between everything and nothing. It's not God, it's not the devil, it's not the demiurge, it's not unity, it's not time, it's not space, it's not an event. There isn't anything there. Then, after that meaningless non-event, the negative first iteration, then there's the 0th iteration, which is the opposite of that, the negation of that, which is an iteration where all the parts integrate into something. And so if you were to think of the set of all sets, which contains everything, at the 0th iteration, the set of all sets contains nothing, because at the 0th iteration, there aren't any iterations yet to have fit anything in it. And so the iteration itself is existent, because it's a totality, it's an arrangement where all of its parts are integrated, and its parts form the reference frame, which is the reference frame within which everything that we can observe exists. And that's how you fit that concept into something that makes sense. So when you start off with the set of all sets, with the everything set. You have to start with nothing, and then you have to put that nothing in something, which I call a reference frame. It's sort of like putting it in the window so you can see it, putting it on the monitor so that it can be displayed, putting it in front of you so that you can see it. It describes the putting in front ofness of it. Now, there might not yet be anything there, but this is describing the creation of a camera that then looks at and sees and observes and discerns everything else. So it isn't a thing, it's a frame of reference which describes the thing, which defines the limits of what that thing is and what that thing is not. And that's the process of naming something. When I name something, then I'm saying I can define it such that I can interchange this name with it, and the explanation that I give to you in a story with it in there or with its name in there, it's the same thing, it's the same story. If I tell you a prediction about what I believe will happen to that thing in the future, I can use the name of it and I can predict something regarding the name, and that prediction regarding the name will be exactly the same as the prediction involving the thing that it's naming. And that's the creation of an iteration or a reference frame. And that is the very first thing that ever comes into being, and it's necessary, because if you don't have a reference frame, then whatever it is that you're looking at can't be looked at, and there is no looking at anything. And so then there are no names, and there are no words, and there is no time, and there is no space, and there's no discrete difference between one thing and another, etc. So, what I believe happened is the static nature of context, given that there was no content yet, there is the integration of a context in which the context is static and unmoving. There's a context which could change, either grow or shrink. And then there's anti-context, which would be content. It would be the difference between context and content is the difference between a reference frame, a window, and the thing that I'm looking at through the window, the referent itself. The difference between those two things is basically what defines what it is to be a referent or a reference frame, what it is to be an object in the window, and what it is to be a window. And so the state of things as it tries to emerge out of this chaos is, at first there's three of these things simultaneously. But they're in different, there are three of these things simultaneously, but they all occupy the same place, which is unity. And then they separate and diverge because they perpetuate themselves and annihilate each other. And that's what makes them separate and become discernible. They affirm themselves and perpetuate themselves, but they annihilate or contradict each other. And so the only thing that they can do is separate and become discernible. And what they become discernible into are these three contexts, which is the context of no context, which would be like random noise, like a radio fuzz in between channels. There's no context. But that is itself, paradoxically, a context. And then there's the context of something changing all the time, which would be a reference frame that's always growing. And then there's a static reference frame, which never changes and always stays. It never shrinks, but it also never grows. It just stays exactly static. So nothing never changes, and the devil is associated with nothing. And so it's not the devil is not the context of no context. That's the demiurge. That's the radio fuzz. It's neither good nor evil. It has nothing to say. It's just gibberish. It's just noise. That's the demiurge. Random fuzz, noise. Nothing discernible, but not nothing. It's not silence. It's radio static. And then there's the static as it actually, see, that's going to get confusing. The radio noise, and in between channels is not silence. So we don't say that that's nothing. The nothing is the static view that never changes. The context in which nothing changes. Because nothing never changes. So the context of nothing is never changingness. It is the context in which nothing ever changes. There is no change. It's just stuck, static, one way. That is the devil's view. The context of the devil's view, the reason that the devil values or doesn't value anything in existence is because of the context of never changing. So if there's a context of never changing, and that's the reference frame, and then you see everything else through that lens, and the lens never changes, and yet you see everything, then there must be an infinite distance in between the reference frame and everything else, because everything else is not static. And that's why you have to have an infinitely huge reference frame, because if the reference frame can't change in order to focus in on the creation or anything that we could conceive of as existing, if it can't focus because it's just way too goddamn big, imagine zooming all the way out. So we'll start from human scale. So you've got your own thing that you're looking at. You've got a desk and a computer and some floss and a beer and whatever in front of you. Now, if you zoom out of that, then you'll visualize, okay, I can see my apartment building. And then you zoom out further than that, and then the apartment building shrinks into a dot, and you see a whole bunch of other buildings and streets and cars and stuff like that. And then you zoom out even further than that. Now you can't even see your apartment. Not only are you yourself invisible, but the apartment that you live in is invisible. And then the city that your apartment lives in is a dot. And then it becomes invisible. And then the environment of it becomes invisible, and so on and so on and so on, until all the environments become invisible, and the only thing that's left after you zoom all the way out is just pure void blackness, because even creation just shrinks into a single point. Why is that? Because it has to fit within a reference frame that never moves, and yet creation moves. So you have to start from a huge ass canvas in order to paint all of those paintings. Because you have to remember that that you can paint an infinite number of paintings. Every single painting starts, let's say, with a single pixel. Then you have 2 pixels. Then you have 4. And then 8, 32, 64, so on and so forth. And let's say it doubles every time, which is sort of like the population growth. I guess you could use E if you wanted to use an even more precise figure, because that's at least a growth constant. So let's say it's E. So every single time it increases, every iteration, every painting increases in size by E. Well, that will approach infinity. So then the reference frame has to be infinite. But creation is not always at that last largest bit. In fact, it never reaches it, but it's always approaching it, which then means that your reference frame has to exist as if creation were already that big, infinitely huge, and yet it isn't yet infinitely huge, nor will it ever actually become infinitely huge, because infinity isn't a number. So when you zoom all the way out like that, in order to fit everything in, you basically fill the entire canvas with nothing but Vanta black. It's just pure black void, with not even a dot for existence. It shrinks to it always perpetually the same size, no matter how long, no matter which frame that you look at, in a relativistic sense, in a finite photographic sense. If you were to look at the world or creation at any point in time, according to the devil, there is nothing there. It's just black void, because the amount of space that existence currently or at that current time occupies in relation to the hugeness that it could one day become is always infinite. The distance is always infinite. So that makes the point that it's going to occupy infinitesimally small, which, if you were to visualize this, it would be like trying to see a single electron or a single photon, and yet you're at the edge of the universe, and you're trying to see a single photon at the center of the universe. It's so dim and it's so small, and it's not even traveling toward you. It just shrinks into nothing. There's nothing there to see. The light has become so dim that you can't see any of it anymore. And so that's what happens when you have a static context, where you think of everything as being unmoving, that the truth never changes, that there are facts that don't ever change, and that's what's real. And if you start saying stuff like that, then you will begin to feel nihilistic, because you'll start to say things like there's no inherent meaning to existence. Well, if you were to be really accurate, there is no existence, because if we're going to talk about relativity, the amount of space and time that existence has thus far occupied is infinitesimally small and tiny in comparison to the vast infinitude of space and time that existed before it and will exist after it. So it is meaningless. It's sort of like what happens when you start to think of the entire world and everyone in it when you don't believe in God. Then you start to have that existential absurdity. Why do all these things even exist? Why do they even bother existing? There's no reason for it, and yet there's so much of them, but yet we only occupy this pale blue dot floating randomly out into some spiral arm of a galaxy that presumably no one's ever even been to, nor would have any reason to go to. It's sort of like a scream in the dark that no one else can hear but the screamer. Why are you screaming? It's pointless. You see what I'm saying? That's the nihilism. And that context existed before there was any content to render. Because like I say, what is the content of that context? Well, given relativity and the infinite distance between the window frame and the tiny little speck of a dot that it's trying to show you, there's an infinite distance in between those two. And so arguably there is no content, or the content is so tiny and so vague that you can't even begin to describe it. It basically isn't even there. It's just not there. So there's no content, but there's only context, and the context never changes. And what is that context? Is the context of the devil, the context of the nothing, the context of there not being any value to anything, that we were born against our will, we die against our will, and arguably everything that we experience in life is against our will, and so then there's just no point to anything, and the only thing that we really have at the end of it all is suffering. And so then the value of all of those things reduces to a negation, an infinite devaluation of all things, to say that it is nothing but waste, excreting waste. And that is logically valid, but it's not very wise. So this is the limit of logic, where it's like, yeah, you could say that, but if you did, then look at the implicative causes and effect relationship that you've created, and tell me what the consequence of that is destruction. you can't build anything off of that. You can't make that meaningful unless you go beyond it. So when you do go beyond it, then you say, well, I just don't know what the value of anything would ever really be, because I can't really get to the core of what anything really is in and of itself. It's all interconnected. And if I take the value of one thing and I try to compare it to the value of another thing, I get that same infinite distance that I got with that static context. So then the context is always changing, and ostensibly the context is always growing. And so then I would say, well, if everything is interrelated, then the value of it could be said to automatically increase the more things that exist that there are, because it'll be more interconnected, because there will be more things that exist. So then there must be something intrinsically valuable about existing and being unique and being your own being your own person, because you then form unique webs of relations which ricochet off other relations, forming this massive infinite change that happens over every single person's life and ripples throughout everything in existence. So then everything becomes infinitely valuable, because your focus is directly on the relationship between two or more things. And so then the relativity is in full view. And so that is what's determining the scope or the size of the window frame. Is the window frame is only as big then as the relationship between whatever it is that you're looking at and yourself. Meaning that the window is clean, the window frame is to your own scale, like human scale, like a normal window. And then you can see clearly through it. You can see whatever is on the opposite side without it being obscured, or without the window frame being so tiny that you can't see through it, or so huge that you can't tell what you're actually supposed to focus on, but rather that it's at the scale of the thing that you're looking at. And it grows and shrinks according to whatever it is that you're looking at. So when you want to look across the entire horizon, the window grows and it becomes as big as the horizon, so you can see the entire bit that you're trying to look at. When you want to focus on something and you only want to see one thing, the window shrinks so that you can focus and zoom in on that one thing that you are trying to focus on. So that context is dependent upon the thing that it's focusing on, which makes the context always change. And the context then changes on whatever the content is, and it tries to reflect the value of the content rather than impose a value upon the content by the context. So that, I think, I personally like to think that that is more akin to what God would do, but that's not actually accurate, because God is transcendent. This is the context of being. It's not necessarily the context of God, but it is the context of being. And so it says that the value of whatever the content is the value of whatever the relationship between that content and the consumer of the content is. And it says that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Everything can then be beautiful. And is beautiful. To someone, somewhere, at some time, it was beautiful. So I like to think that that's how God would view everything, is that it would have value somewhere at some time to someone in some way, that there's a value to it. And then if you go beyond that, then you've got the context of indiscernibility, which is the context of no context, which is just the content in and of itself with no reference frame. So this would be like trying to see through a wall at something on the other end, because the window has now shrunk, being that it's basically the exact opposite of the huge ass window frame that never changes. You've got a tiny ass window frame that's so small that it isn't even there, so you can't see anything on the other side of it, except maybe like one pixel, a single ray of light. So you can't really tell what that is. It could be the sun, it could be the reflection off of a mirror, it could be a tree, it could be a frog, it could be a bird, it could be the sky, it could be the ground, it could be grass, whatever. Who knows what it is? And that's what makes it indiscernible. And that context is indiscernible because it's not non-existent. It's not like a wall. It's saying that there is some kind of intrinsic context that the content itself has, but because that context is rendered inside the content itself, it never travels to you so that you can see it, but it's aware of its own self. It's aware of its own value. It isn't that it has no value, like the devil's context of everything being infinitesimally tiny in comparison to the giant void of nothing that is always surrounding it. It's not that, and it's also not taking the content as far as where it's related to some other content into consideration. It's isolating the content so that it has no relation with anything else, and then trying to visualize what that value would be. And it's like a self-relation. It's like a self-value. So it's the context of no context, because by the time you've reduced down to the content level itself, then the window frame is trying to be the outline of the thing that you're trying to look at and has become the thing that you're looking at, or at least is indiscernible from it, because it wraps around it so tight that it becomes the thing that it's trying to let you look at. So the context shrinks around the content to the point where there's no discernible difference between the context and the content. And that's what people usually refer to as quote-unquote self-evident. But it isn't. There is no such thing as self-evident that we know of, because we aren't that self. If I look at a rock, the rock is the rock unto the rock. I don't have any access to that. That is indiscernible to me. But it's there because the rock is there. So if the rock is there and there's some limit to that rock, then there's something that it sees, there's something that it interacts with, there's some kind of an existence to it, but I wouldn't be able to describe what that is because it's the size of the rock. It's at that level. It's not something that I can go beyond and see. It's something that's wrapped up in it. Or at the very least, it's stuck at the same limit as it. So it never travels to me for me to see it. So that is the context of indiscernibility. Those three reference frames are what then occupy the origin, such that the origin has 3 points. It doesn't have a single point. It has 3 points. And those 3 points form, I like to think, a periphery, a volume, and a center of this singularity that I call unity, which temporally occupies the 0th iteration. That's when it happens. It happens just before the first iteration, just before the first moment. It happens before that. And spatially, it happens at the greatest possible scale, the largest possible scope. In fact, if you were to visualize all those windows, you would see that the devil's view is actually the largest. The view of being, which is dependent upon the content relation to other contents, would then be, I guess, occupying the volume of that, and then the content of context of no context would be that thing isolated, the content isolated and unrelated to everything else. So there's lots of ways of looking at that. If you wanted to look at each of them inside of the others, you could. I try not to, because it seems to me to be advocating for the devil's view, because that's the biggest view within which everything else exists. And I don't know if that's really accurate, because what about that as content? Does that not then fit into the other two window frames? Is that not then related to the other two contexts? And if it is related to those contexts, then I can view it as if it were a bit of content inside of the window frame of being, where I'm looking at the relationship between it and the context of no context, the content in and of itself, kind of a thing. In other words, how does it view itself? Because I'm looking at the relation of it being interconnected, and then I'm looking at the context of it, which would be like a meta context. It's the self beyond the self. It's the box that contains the box. It's the iteration beyond the iteration. And so if you were to take the devil's view and you were to take it one step further, what does it have to say about itself? And that is that it also is nothing but an infinitesimal point and doesn't actually exist. And so then you've got a negation, and so it negates itself. And this is the self-destructive nature of the devil, and this is the reason why every single time it generates falsehoods or paradoxes or lies, as the Bible puts it. And you can see exactly how that all happens. It's because if you were to take this painting, or whatever you want to call it, image, snapshot, photograph of creation as being an infinitesimally small point, enveloped in nothing but pure darkness and void, which is the space between where creation is in that snapshot and the space where it will be in the indefinite, infinite future from now. There's nothing, because that's an infinitude of negation. There's nothing there, because the distance between where it currently is and infinity is always an infinite amount of distance. No matter how large the number is, no matter which photograph that I take, there's always going to be an infinitude of distance between that and the final photograph, if you wanted to call it that. Even the final photograph has another infinite distance between itself and the reference frame. So creation collapses and shrinks into nothing. And so then when you take that, let's say painting, where basically it would just be van to black, just nothing but pure blackness all over the painting, with not even a dot in the center, just blackness. And you were to take that painting as if it were the content itself, and picture yourself as beyond the painting, looking at the painting, what would that painting say about itself? It would remove itself from the room. You wouldn't even be able to see it, because that's what it says about everything, is that it's so tiny that it doesn't even measure up. It doesn't even exist. It shouldn't even be noted. Well, then neither should that. Neither should the idea that everything is like that. And that's what I've said several times in the past about nihilism refuting itself or contradicting itself. The idea that there is no value to any idea has no value because it doesn't value itself according to itself. Now, you could say it does have value, but you would have to stand outside of it and say that. Because if you take its side, then you have to agree with it and say that it also has no value. But if you disagree with it, then you move beyond it and you say, no, it does have value, it just doesn't recognize it. So this is what happens when you take the position of these contexts, or focal points of those contexts. When you take those and then you put them in the other contexts, then it's like God looking at the devil, or the demiurge looking at God, or the demiurge looking at the devil, or the devil looking at the demiurge. Which one is on which side of the window? Are you the one that's looking in or the one that's looking out? Are you looking at this or are you looking at that? And so they all have their own views of each other. And ironically, God and the demiurge both sustain the devil, but the devil destroys the devil. It's weird. It's like the devil votes against everything and says, no, it shouldn't exist. No, it doesn't have any value. Even to himself. No, I don't have any value either. And then the devil gets refuted or disagreed with by God and the demiurge, who both advocate for the devil's existence, or at the very least disagree that the devil should, cease existing, and say, no, you should continue to exist. And the devil says, nope, I don't believe that I should, and I don't believe anything should. And then the demiurge says, well, I don't know about that. And God says, you're wrong. You do have value. You just don't see it. And it's weird. And then, of course, like I had said, with the devil with the devil valuing everything as if it were nothing, then God is valueless to the devil, and so is the demiurge. But yet, both God and the demiurge find the devil valuable, but the devil doesn't find either of them valuable. And the demiurge is unsure about the value and says that the value is just in accordance to whatever it is. It just is whatever it is. It's some unknowable amount that I'm not personally going to take a stake on. It just has its own value. It's its own thing. So it's not really an affirmation or denial from the demiurge. It's just sort of a neutral stance. So if you look at this from the devil's perspective, he's got two people who, one of whom values his existence, the other of whom at least is neutral and doesn't think that the devil has no value. And then the devil himself thinks that he has no value. The demiurge has God that says that he has infinite value, and the devil that says that he has no value. So then he's sitting there going, I don't really know how much value that I have, because I've got one guy saying I have infinite value, and I've got one guy saying that I have zero value, and so I don't know, but I guess it would be somewhere in between. And then you've got God, who's got one of them saying that he has no value, and the other one that says that whatever his value is must just be whatever he says it is, because there's no there's no way to really measure what that value would be. So he doesn't get any affirmation from the other two. Both of them get affirmation from God, but God doesn't get affirmed by either of those two. He just has to sustain himself, which he does perfectly fine. But it's just strange to keep that in mind, that even from a logical perspective, without taking Christianity into account or anything, that you automatically, logically have to understand that this is the case. It's weird to see that there is this sacrifice, this absolutely necessary sacrifice of having to sustain oneself against all odds, against negativity and just bland neutrality. You've got to push yourself forward. And it's like, wow, that's what that means. And that's just talking about reference frames. And this is all about the 0th iteration. I'm going to write a book about it. But so far, that's the ideas that I've got about it. And so like I had said, where does that leave us in relation to it? Well, it's how we relate to those three. Which of those do we agree with or disagree with overall? And that's our approach to existence. And that's who we're going to go to when we die. Now, we don't ever become any of those three things, so we'll never become nothing. We'll never become everything. And we'll never become anything in the sense of it being like where it's just perfectly neutral. We're going to have some kind of preference or non-preference towards things. So we're either going to like or dislike things. We're never going to feel absolutely neutral about absolutely everything. There are some things that we are neutral about. But we're never going to be neutral about everything. We're never going to be hateful about everything. We're never going to be loving about everything. There's going to be, a mixture of those three contexts in each of our contexts, because our contexts are finite derivative combinations of those contexts. So when we die, we have an overall view of what we've experienced throughout life. And we say, I believe that existence has this value. If you say it has a good value, you go towards being in God. If you say it has a bad value, that it sucks, then you're going to go towards the devil. If you take a more neutral stance and you say, actually, I've experienced about half and half here, it really does look like it's just whatever you look at it like. Like you're agnostic about it. I don't actually believe that there is an intrinsic value to anything that could be discerned. So therefore everything is just whatever it is. And I don't feel good or bad about it. I'm indifferent, at rest or something like that. Kind of almost like a Buddhist view where you just don't really take a stand either way. You just say, well, it is whatever it is. And then you'll go to the demiurge. And in my opinion, you've got heaven, hell, and then purgatory would be the demiurge, where you just don't have an opinion about things. I believe that if you take that view overall towards existence, that when you die, you just sleep, a dreamless sleep. And then you get reincarnated into presumably the same body that you left from. So, because nothing will have changed, you'll still be exactly the same person when you wake up as when you went to sleep, because you didn't experience any dreams in between then. Now, if you do dream, then you're either going to have a good dream because you went towards God and you valued existence overall, or you're going to have a nightmare and you're going to go to hell with the devil and find existence to be just disgustingly, horrifyingly, frighteningly evil. So it depends. Where we go at death really depends on how we viewed our life, and that is, like I say, ultimately derivative of where we all began. And that, I believe, came from our, if we didn't yet form a choice, we randomly happened to find ourselves located somewhere in between God, the devil, and the demiurge. And we're either closer to God or closer to the devil, or closer to the demiurge than we are to either of the other two. We're always closer to one than we are of the other two, overall and in specificity. We either are neutral, affirmative, or denial towards something, refutational. It's I refuse it or something. So that's how we all can relate to what that zeroth iteration teaches, is that there's a reason behind all of it, and that reason is, if you have faith, you will succeed. If you don't have faith, you will not succeed. And if you if you go even further and you have faith in your own destruction, then you will be destroyed. You know, if you think that you're going to get into a fight with your wife, you'll get into one. If you think that you're going to have a good time with your wife, you might have a small little fight, but it'll only last a few minutes, and then it'll be over, and then you'll have a good time. And that's just the way that everything is in existence. And so then what do you say about that overall? Well, I say it's because there's these three contexts, and we have the ability to choose between them. Given that randomness, we have the ability to choose where we want to, which numbers we want to put in for our lottery ticket. We all have to play the lottery. You can't win if you don't play. If you don't play, you just don't ever get anywhere. If you play and you lose, well, at least you tried. If you play and you win, well, then you're free. So that's where it leaves all of us, irregardless of whichever one that we choose, we can't ever become that. So even if we do go to hell for a relative eternity at our own death, we individually experience an eternity, a timeless epoch in that context, according to our own relative, finite, particular, bent approach, which is never going to be absolute. It's not going to be so perfectly hellacious that we take on the context of the devil himself, but we may get close to it. And then it's like, okay, do you want, so you've looked at existence that way, and then you form your final painting of it. You paint your final painting of everything that you've ever experienced and your overall opinion of it. And then you have to stare at that for the rest of your own personal existence. Now, when that is over, that's sort of like the infinite iteration as far as we're concerned on this side of the fishbowl. At the end of that eternity, then yes, you get reincarnated. But by the time that you get reincarnated, you're no longer the same person, and that's why you have a different life. If you were not exposed to an eternity or an eternal epoch in between incarnations, you could only ever get reincarnated as the same person over and over and over again, because there's nothing there for you to have learned from. There's no context that you would have actually been given. You just repeat everything over and over and over. The reason that we get incarnated into different bodies with different lives is because we learn to value different things. And we value those things differently from when we were born, because there was something that happened to us during our life that made us shift one way or the other. Now, given that we have the time here that we have, what we're doing is we're reforming ourselves. We had, before our birth, spent an eternity in some place, and we can tell where that was, where our past life was, dependent upon the conditions that we had at our birth. So good, bad, or indifferent, and like I say, according to specificity. So you can look at it in general. Like my birth in my childhood was in some ways auspicious, because I was born in America instead of in Africa. So I had enough food to eat, and I was going to be physically at least taken care of. But I also was neglected. And I spent most of my time either reading books or staring at the blank wall and just thinking. And so, is that good or bad? Well, I thought it was bad when I was a kid, because I was bored, because I never had any friends, because I always had to keep moving. So physically, yeah, I was well fed, but spiritually, I was starving. So, I mean, it kind of depends on how you look at it. However, I was never beaten, like punched in the face or thrown across the fucking room or raped or anything like that. And nobody put cigar butts out on my face or anything. So it could have been a hell of a lot worse, but it could have been a hell of a lot better too. And that's basically how everybody is. Now, there are some people who have a horrendous childhood who get raped over and over and over by their own parent or parents or guardian, and they spend the first 18 years of their life doing nothing but get raped. There's some kids that get raped because they get abducted and put into a sex trafficking ring, and at 2 years old on, they are getting raped violently for 16 hours a day every single day, and barely fed, and no one ever bothered to even name them. So, I mean, the people, I believe, the people that occupied those bodies, that's what they thought about existence when they died in their previous life. That existence is, like I had said about the devil looking at existence, that I didn't get a choice, I didn't get a chance, I didn't want to be here. This place forced itself upon me, and it's like a magnet. You hold that idea in your head. It's not God judging you and saying, okay, well, you don't like my painting, well then, fuck you. It's not like that. It's more like, well, I'm gonna fuck my own ass just to make you watch me burn, Dad. And it's kind of like that. It's like a magnet. Like if you hold on to that view that existence is just here to fuck your ass, I mean, what else does existence really have as a thing that it can do with you other than to fuck your ass? Because you're not really giving it any other chance or choice. Now, if you're at least agnostic about things and you're like, well, I don't really take a stand either way, well, then you'll get a neutral childhood where it's like good and bad, where it's like, well, kind of like, like your parents aren't abusive, but you don't get well taken care of. You're just sort of like, you know, you've got a safe room and everything's okay, but you're not really being like nurtured. You're just sort of kind of there. And you've got good memories and bad memories, but there's just not anything about it that's really striking. It's just sort of like a mild, bland, amorphous kind of, indifferent, oatmeal flavored kind of childhood. Well, that's from not really taking a stand in the previous life, the past life that you had, or that person had, wouldn't have been really to their liking or disliking. And so when they died, their overall picture of that life was indifferent. So they were then born in this next life into an indifferent kind of a childhood. And then there's people that get born into really, really nice childhoods because they had this faith that they would be. And it's sort of like the sperm. It's like, how does the sperm find the egg? Well, first it has to have the faith that it's going to find something to keep it swimming. And then it has to try to orient toward it and pay attention and not think about what it wants to do, but think about where it's going and how it's going to get there. And forming a relationship with its destination rather than itself or its past, where it came from. And that's how it fertilizes the egg. And we go in that way from life to life. And in that way, in the overall sense, God is perfect. It's only the imperfections that we see are temporary, and they're growing pains, and that is to be expected because we came out of chaos. We came out of a mess, a primordial ooze or soup from which we were extracted, and after which we can either choose to perpetuate ourselves or get obliterated and turned back into the soup. And we will just do that over and over and over again, because you can't get more base than soup. You go more base than soup and you'll become the devil himself. Well, there's only one devil. He's already sitting in that seat. You can't sit in that seat. He's already sitting in it. So the worst that we can do as humans is become the Antichrist, which is sitting on the devil's lap in his seat. And in a similar sense, Christ was the only favorite child that got to sit in Daddy's lap on the throne room, kind of a thing. I know how it says in the Bible that he's standing on his right side and all that. Whatever analogy you want to use, however poetically you want to put it. But there's a flavor to it. There's a respect and a reverence for God if you're doing it the right way. If you don't feel reverence about how existence exists, or if worse yet, you feel disgust about how existence exists, then you're going to have an eternity of disgust when you die. What else is there? I believe that God doesn't actually judge anyone. He affirms everyone, and then if you say, I think that everything is shit, well, here's your shit, because that's what you ordered. I think that everything is awesome. Here's the awesome that you ordered. I don't want to make an order. Then you're going to just sit here and I'm going to kind of awkwardly stare at you until you do. So so that's just, what else is there? What else could there have been? What else can there ever be? What else can there be now? Then, can I take your order, please? Okay, here's my order. Okay, here you go. What else is there? So here we are. Now, the advice, the only advice that I could prefer at this point in my life, I've experienced samadhi, which I think is the closest to heaven that I could ever get, which is when I recognize that every single effect in the world is caused by a perfect cause, and that those causes being perfect and the effects that are derivative of them being perfect means that everything already is perfect, and I don't have to change anything. It's already the way that it's supposed to be. When I had that view, that was the greatest joy, exuberance, awe, reverence, calm, peace, serenity, all mixed together that I've ever felt. It reached a peak where I got as close to the right context that I could get, that my window frame could possibly fit within it. And I've also experienced just fucking horror at the way that existence exists. And I've also experienced hatred and disgust and rage to the point of almost dying from, like, my heart will explode if if I continue, and everything in between. And I fucking love that. I think that that's awesome, that I've been able to experience such a vast depth of emotions and stances towards existence, and that there's even more beyond those. And that is the only advice that I can prefer to either myself or someone else is, please remember, God is a loving God, not a hateful God. God loves you. God does not hate you. You have value. Even if you don't see it, God does. Because otherwise you wouldn't be here. And that's all I got to say about that.